Why did Christopher Nolan stop making Batman movies? Now, when I had this question, I kind of just answered it within myself, and I've never really looked up his explanation as to why indeed he stopped. And even people like Christian Bale, what does he think about stopping the Batman films at The Dark Knight Rises? I found a couple videos I want to take a look at that he kind of gives an indication as to what was his reasoning behind stopping at the third film, and also looking at some of the actors, what they thought around the process, because it honestly is not really what you might think.
Was this always set to be a trilogy?
It's a complicated answer because I'm very superstitious.
Okay.
When I went to make the first film, it was very important to me that we never even
That's interesting. He's very superstitious. Wouldn't think that about him.
talk or think about doing another film. It's like, okay, we put everything we've got into Batman Begins. We make the best film we know how to make. Then when people responded to it, when the audience has kind of told me what the film is, then you react to that and you say, okay, you know what? I want to see who that Joker's going to be. The Joker card flipped over at the end of Batman Begins. I want to know who that's going to be. And so then you find yourself drawn into continuing the story. And then at the end of The Dark Knight, we really left Batman in a very odd place. It was a bit of a cliffhanger, really, in a sense, even though I felt like the conclusion of that story. And I found myself and David Goyer and my brother Jonah, my co-writers, we found ourselves just wanting to know what happened next, what happens to Bruce Wayne. We want to finish his story, and that's what we've done.
Now let's switch over to Joseph Gordon-Levitt, where he talks a little bit about his perspective as to why not the continuation. And interesting for him is he came into the third film as Robin. And so if there was ever going to be a continuation of Chris Nolan's Batmans, it would make sense that they lean into his character in a major way, because he just was introduced as Robin. So let's hear his thoughts on this.
Was there any discussion about you being the next Batman?
There wasn't, no. And you know, Chris Nolan directed a trilogy. His plan was always to have 3 movies. He said very specifically, The Dark Knight Rises will be the third and final story of this trilogy that I'm making.
Right.
And I think it's a really good ending, because it talks about it throughout, you know, that Batman is more than a man, and it's a symbol, and we all have a hero within us. And so to have somebody else in the Batcave at the end of that trilogy, not Bruce Wayne, I think is a really cool ending.
So if we take that and we also pair that with kind of what Christopher Nolan said, he was a bit superstitious. He wanted to make sure that they just poured everything they could into making a good Batman Begins film and then go from there. He didn't want to count his chickens before they were hatched. In the same time, you have people like Levitt who are saying that by the third film, he was confident this was his trilogy. And so I have a suspicion, and even from what they're saying, is that although Christopher Nolan started the Batman Begins movie a bit cautious about saying this is going to be a trilogy, it was in his mind the entire time. And he kind of set it up in some ways to say, like, it sort of happened naturally, but in the same way, he left clues. Like at the end of Batman Begins, who's the Joker going to be? The Joker is a very pulverizing character in cinema, in superhero cinema, and in storytelling. And so we want to see what the Joker is going to be like in a Chris Nolan film. So it just left it open-ended. And then Batman was in such a weird place at the end of The Dark Knight that you had to continue the story. You had to finish the arc of his character. Now, some people say that The Dark Knight Rises was not as good. And in fact, a lot of people said it fell very short. And we'll explore that. I want to talk a little bit about trilogy. But before we do that, I want to highlight something interesting that Christian Bale had to say, because Christian Bale, besides Chris Nolan, he's one of the guys that was there the whole time. He was the lead character. Of course, The Dark Knight exploded in 2008, becoming the biggest superhero film to date and one of the biggest movies of all time. So naturally, Warner Bros. Wanted its director and star to return for a third installment. At that point, according to Bale, Nolan declared that it would be nice to put a bow on things and end their run with a completed trilogy. And so that's really when Joseph Gordon-Levitt came on. He got casted and he said, okay, we want this to be a trilogy. We've made it to a third film. We've got an offer. All right, this is the end. We're done here. That didn't stop Warner Bros. From coming back to them after The Dark Knight Rises and offering a fourth film. When that happened, Bale and Nolan stuck to their guns, with Nolan walking away from the idea of Dark Knight 4 entirely. And this is a quote from Christian Bale. Then when they inevitably came to us and said, how about a number 4? I said, no, we have to stick to Chris's dream, which was always to hopefully do a trilogy. Let's not stretch too far and become overindulgent and go for a fourth. I think the word overindulgent that Christian Bale uses here is a very valid descriptor when it comes to telling a multi-film story, when it comes to especially superheroes. And I'm not saying this is like across the board, but when it comes to film, this is actually a really good rule to follow. So let's dive into the idea of trilogies really quickly. If we look at films like Lord of the Rings, right? The 3 trilogy was awesome. It was epic. Everybody loved it. And then when we wanted more and we were excited about more, they were going to do The Hobbit, and it came out. It kind of comparatively to Lord of the Rings was disappointing. All right. Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl was awesome. Dead Men's Chest was awesome. At World's End was debatable. I thought it was awesome. I thought it was a brilliant bow. I mean, you went into Davy Jones' locker. You had the ultimate battle. You destroyed, the corrupt Davy Jones. You reinstalled a new one. There was heartache, but love with Will and Elizabeth. There was so much good at the end of Pirates of the Caribbean 3 at World's End. And then they decided to bring it in and do On Stranger Tides. And then they did a 5th film, Dead Men Tell No Tales. And both of those completely suck. Like, the 3rd movie was perfect the way it ended. They should have stopped there. Even Star Wars, the original trilogy, like let's dive into that for a second. You had A New Hope, you had Empire Strikes Back, and you had Return of the Jedi. As a trilogy, that was amazing. And then years later, they were like, we're gonna reboot Star Wars. George Lucas is doing some more. Here we go. And then Phantom Menace came out when I was a kid. I actually remember that being my first Star Wars film was Phantom Menace. Little kids were loving it because there was sword fighting and everything. But the fans of Star Wars were like, what is this? What's this nonsense? There were so many people that watched the prequel trilogy and just hated it because they had the expectation of the original trilogy and they were so excited about what George Lucas could do building on that, and it ultimately let them down. Now, the prequel trilogy has its own cult following of, individuals around my age, and that still have a lot of love for the original trilogy. But there are trilogies that take place inside of Star Wars that are loved, and then when they go to a 4th, they're disliked. And you can find this time after time after time. Sometimes stories don't quite hit on their 3rd film. Look at The Godfather. You have Godfather, which was a banger. You have Godfather Part 2, which everyone just agrees is the biggest banger. Like, everybody loves that. And then you had Godfather Part 3, where a lot of people felt like it lost itself a bit. But it wasn't a horrible film. It just wasn't as good as 1 and 2. It's the same thing with, the Batman films. So there's a general rule that I feel like filmmakers especially should follow and take up Christopher Nolan's example here, because he's onto something. He looked at previous trilogies and solidified in his mind. If you want to tell like a big story in film, do it in a trilogy. I think if you go past a trilogy, you're becoming, as Christian Bale said, overindulgent, and it kind of just puts stink on the entire franchise. A 1, a 2, and a 3 movie process is a lot of work And if you can pull it off, take your wins, you know? I mean, there's going to be some people that think you lost it at 2 or something, but if you can make it to 3 and people predominantly love your trilogy, then take it and get out. Don't become overindulgent and try to extend your hand. And if you have an even bigger story that you can't really fit inside of 3 films, then I would consider like looking at a series, legitimately, even on places like YouTube. If you're an indie filmmaker and you're like, hey, I had this really big idea for like a trilogy or a film, but then I'm like, oh, it's so big, it would take like 5 to 6 movies to get all this done. Well, I would say consider doing like a series on YouTube. But to bring it all the way back to the beginning, Christopher Nolan stopped Batman because he felt that he wanted to make a good Batman film. And if he could, because he's super suspicious, make it to 3 movies to make a complete rounded out trilogy. He wasn't sure if he was going to get there, but he did. And ultimately it created, at least in the middle, for A Dark Knight, one of the most amazing superhero films the world has ever seen. Truly has ever seen. I hope this was helpful. I hope it was what you were looking for. Go ahead and like the video so more people can see it, and subscribe to the channel so you can see more videos of me talking about filmmaking and movies. I'll see you next time.